Hello everybody and welcome to my channel. I have for you today the Feature Friday video for February. That is where I take one inexpensive craft item and see how many ways I can play with it to use in my scrapbooking. Today's Feature Friday product is embroidery floss, so let's get started. The first way we're going to use it is to wrap some shapes. Now you can just wrap photo mats or you can wrap photos themselves, as we'll see in a moment. You can wrap it with one layer or multiple layers. Here I'm showing you a couple of different ways that I wrap on just a piece of pattern paper that I'm going to use as a layer on a layout. And the first one, I just wrapped it straight around. Sometimes the floss will slide on you and that can become annoying. So sometimes I will punch a little notch with a small circle punch to help hold the floss in place so it doesn't slide around. Now up here, a very common way to use it is to wrap it and then tie some bows. Sometimes I will even tie bows and cut them loose and save them to add to projects later. And I just use a glue dot to add them on if I'm not actually going to tie them on. So that is another way to do bows. You can certainly mix and match your colors. Here I'm using 3 different colors at a time. And so when I wrap once, I'm going to get 3 layers of floss. And I do fuss with this a little bit as I try to get all of the layers to kind of not overlap each other and to be single layers that go across. And now for this one, I'm going to give myself some extra length and then tape it to the back. And you'll see me using a lot of tape in this video to secure things in place. And here I am, instead of doing a bow, which can sometimes be fiddly, I'm just tying a knot and letting the tails dangle. And that is a very simple way to add some embroidery floss. Now let's talk about wrapping some shapes. I took out a bunch of punches, and that top piece we'll get to later, but these flowers and that kind of scallop circle punch, we're going to start with there. And so for this one, I am using, instead of tape, I'm using a glue dot just because that shape is so tiny that tape would be hard to maneuver. And then I'm just wrapping around the center of the flower and using another glue dot to secure that in place. And then I've got a little wrapped flower. Here I am just with a bigger flower, and instead of wrapping across the middle of the flower, I'm wrapping around each petal of the flower, and that gives a different look there. And then for that other shape, this scallop circle shape, I am wrapping it straight across. And this one totally reminds me of that old craft project where you're wrapping embroidery floss around little nails to create string art. So that's kind of fun. And you can get more complicated with it and do something along those lines with some brads and string and such. I'm trying to keep things a little simpler today. Now with this punch, I actually created a stencil, and then it's a little hard to see on the video, but I used the stencil to draw some shapes on, and then I'm going to use a pin to poke holes in my shape, and we're going to start stitching. Now if you don't want to do stitching, it doesn't interest you at all, that's okay. I have more tips for you. So while stitching is going to take up a little bit of our time here, don't worry, there's more coming. So what I did with this first one is that I traced a banner shape with a pencil. And because the banner shape is straight lines, when you use a pencil, you don't have to worry about erasing it too much because your thread will be in straight lines and it will cover up your pencil lines. Now I am doing these on separate pieces of cardstock, and then I'm going to attach them to a project. You could certainly do this entirely straight onto your project. If you make a little mistake, it's harder to fix it. So just keep that in mind when you're deciding. That last little bit, you saw me poking holes in another shape. And what I did was I took that chevron-shaped stencil piece and I made a row of chevrons. And then I'm going to go ahead and stitch all these chevrons. So when you're stitching a larger piece, there's various ways to go about it. But for this chevron shape, I just tried to stitch into the next hole. And you might end up skipping bits of your stitching, but you can always go back and fill those in later. This isn't meant to be a stitching tutorial necessarily, but instead just an example of various ways to add this texture of floss to your project. So you can see as I'm stitching along, it's starting to build up that chevron shape, and I do kind of skip over bits and pieces as I go and then fill them in back. And that is just really to save materials, because if you stitch farther away, you're going to use up more materials. So the next one I'm going to use two different pieces. That is a die cut circle that has some stitching lines already in it as part of the die. And this next one, I just used a die to trace a circle, and then I'm poking my own holes around the shape. And we're going to talk a little bit about tips with sewing on curves. But for this first shape, I am just going to stitch across it. And you saw me kind of pulling out the thread. What I'm doing is I'm counting how many times across my poked holes are, and then I'm pulling out enough thread to go across my hole that many times. So if I have 9 holes in my project, or rather 18 because you need sets of holes, then I'm going to pull out 9 loops of thread. Now here, if you don't want to go diagonally across, you can draw straight vertical or horizontal lines, but for these, I like the diagonal because it builds up this kind of spiral texture in the center of the project. And I am just stitching across and being sure to come up and down through the next hole in this project. The reason I poke holes first before I sew is that sewing needles aren't meant to poke holes in paper. They're meant for fabric. And so it's a little easier on your hands and a little easier on the needle to pre-poke holes. And I do that with a regular sewing pin that I just use for craft projects. I don't ever use those ones back when I'm sewing on fabric because it will dull the pin heads and such. So up next, I'm going to stitch around the circle just with a straight stitch, and I wanted to give you some tips on this. The longer your stitches are, the less they're going to curve, because when you connect 2 straight points, it's going to make a straight line. And so if you're going to stitch on curves, you need to have smaller stitches, and you can see me, I'm poking more holes into my circle as we go and showing you how that stitch length is going to look. Pardon my head as I thread my needle. So that one is a shorter stitch length, but it still looks too much like a straight line. So I'm going to poke more holes in this circle as we go. And this is a geometry lesson if you do math at all, about how circles are formed. And so I try to keep to like maybe less than 1/4 of an inch for a stitch length on a curve. And the tighter your curves are, again, the smaller stitch lengths you're going to need. But I need to give you a word of caution here because paper is not the same as fabric. If your stitches get too close together, you can risk tearing out and your holes will become one giant hole instead of 2 separate little holes. And that can be a problem for your stitch length. So keep that in mind. Now I'm going to work on this pre-cut die cut with stitches impressed into it from the die. And I'm going to combine those 2 green circles that I did. I'm going to stitch across, and then also I'm going to stitch around. And as I'm working on this piece, I'm kind of doing both as I go, but you could certainly do them separately. And because, again, this is paper and not fabric, you have to be careful with these dies because those little stitch holes are small and you can risk tearing out your fabric. So I recommend using a nice heavy cardstock weight on this. Don't use a flimsy pattern paper because that can be a problem. If you're using any kind of cardstock, you can use pattern paper, cardstock, whatever you want. It doesn't have to just be white, but I'm using white here to show you more detail in this video. And we'll skip me sewing all of that. And here is the finished product. It does combine both of those, so it goes around the edges and across. And you can see there's a lot more stitching across, so you get a lot more texture. Now I'm going to show you how to stitch on words. And this is just like the circle where I'm going to make sure that I stitch around and give myself plenty of small stitch lengths so it's going to go around those curves. Now I'm going to show you the V is actually straight lines, and you can approach that a couple of different ways, and we'll get to that. Now you could also do the circles, the words. If you have stamps, you can stamp images, say like maybe a teddy bear for a baby card in a light ink, and then poke your holes and continue on with this process. So here is that V in a straight line, or here is the V with stitched lines to match everything else. It's up to you. The straight line will save time, but it won't match as well, but that could be an extra textural font element if you like. If you don't like to sew, then this is the next tip for you. Instead of sewing, what you can do is apply glue to your project. And here I am. I'm going to write out the word love in glue. And I'm using probably not the best glue for this because the glue dry a little bit shiny and you can see any oozy bits. So I would recommend the Ranger Matte Multi-Medium Glue, and I will put a link in the description below. But I use this glue here so you could see it nice and bold. And what you can do is draw shapes. You could draw stars, hearts, circles, whatever you want, cursive, and then just lay your string down into your glue. And again, you can do this on a separate piece and cut it out and add it to your project, or you can do it straight on your project. Your fingers will get sticky doing this, but the glue, if you rub it, it will dry itself out and then flake off your fingers. And you can see me doing that there, and that solves that problem. And then I just let it dry overnight and you're good to go. And after drying, this is the piece I think came out the best, but you can see that glue there, like I mentioned. So I do recommend the other glue, and the link will be there. Up next is another no-sew element that you can add. So here we are with tassels. First thing I do is I cut off 2 lengths because we're going to need 1 length to tie a loop to the tassel and 1 length to tie the top portion of the tassel. So I keep 1 length cut off in between my upper fingers, and you can see me pulling that up as we go. And that's going to be my tie. And then I'm going to kind of weigh down my tassel and use this other length. I just set my project on top of it, tie 1 knot, and then wrap it a few times, and then tie it back to itself and clip off the excess. And now we've got the beginnings of a tassel. I'm going to go ahead and tie off that top there to give myself the hanging bit of the tassel. And then this is all loops because you wrapped it around your fingers, and I have to cut those loops to open it up into a tassel. Now, if you use fewer fingers, you'll get a smaller loop and smaller tassel. Now, when I am working, I've got a whole bunch of leftover bits from working. So what I do is I pull all these threads out. I line up the ends of the threads and kind of make a row of all the leftover bits. And then I will stick them down into a line of glue and clip them, and then stick and clip and stick and clip. And as I run out of little pieces, I'll just, if they're too short, I toss them aside, pull in any other lengths that I've got to keep the fullness going, and stick and clip. And we'll see that when I'm done with this process, and there I pulled out some more threads, and I'm feeling like I don't have quite enough colors left to keep this going. When I'm done with this process, I'll just cut off a scrap piece, add some glue on it, and then stick it down to the top. Now that's going to hold everything in place so that it doesn't shed on you. And now you've got a fringe row of leftover bits. And then likewise with leftover bits, I will do this messy thread look. Now you've probably seen people do this with actual thread, and you can do the exact same thing with floss, where you just bunch it up into kind of a messy, loopy situation, glue it down to your project, tuck it under something so that you can hide the glue on that because it's a little hard to hold it all down, and then you've got some more texture going on. So here I am bringing everything together. I am not going to show you the title or journaling on this layout because it does have some private information on there, but I wanted to show you the main section of the layout. So I cut all of these elements apart, and then I am attaching and gluing them all down to my layout. And like I said before, you can certainly do all of the stitching on the background of your paper. I can imagine a plain white sheet of cardstock with a whole bunch of fun circles scattered across it, and that could just be your entire background, and then photos and journaling on top of that, and you'd have a lovely project. Now those tassels I didn't use on this project because my daughter graduated last year and I made those tassels in her school colors, so I'm going to save those tassels for a future project. I hope you got something helpful out of this video. Even if just one thing was interesting, go ahead and give my video a like because that does help my channel. I appreciate you watching, and I will be back next week with some scrapbook process videos for you. I'll see you next time.